I am not writing this to convince you. I have no interest in debating theology or arguing with skeptics in the comment section. I'm a man of science. I deal in load-bearing walls, tensile strength, and the unforgiving laws of physics. For 40 years, my God was logic. My Bible was a set of blueprints. If I could not measure it, weigh it, or calculate its breaking point, it did not exist. I'm telling you this story because silence is no longer an option for me. I saw something that defies every calculation I ever made. I went to a place where mathematics dissolves, and the only structural reality is pain. So you can doubt me. You can analyze this with your rational mind. It does not change the fact that I have been there. My name is Einar. I am a structural engineer based in Reykjavik, Iceland. My entire career has been built on the premise of stability. I design foundations that hold up skyscrapers against the North Atlantic winds. I calculate the precise amount of concrete needed to keep a family safe while they sleep in their beds. I was good at my job. I was arrogant about my job. I looked at the world and saw a chaotic mess that needed to be ordered by men like me. I looked at religion and saw a crutch for people who were afraid of the dark. I know the kind of content that circulates online. I know you might be watching this because you are searching for Christian testimonies, or perhaps you stumbled upon this while looking for near-death experiences. A few years ago, I would have mocked you for that. I used to see titles about impactful testimonies or powerful testimonies of hell, and I would laugh. I thought they were hysterical. I thought they were psychological fabrications created by desperate minds to cope with the fear of mortality. I viewed evangelical testimonies as emotional propaganda. I believed that when the brain dies, the lights go out, and the equation simply ends. 0 equals 0. There is no remainder. I was wrong. The equation does not end. It was a Tuesday in late November. The darkness comes early in Reykjavik during the winter. By 2 in the afternoon, the sky is already a bruised purple, and the streetlights are humming against the gloom. We were working on a high-profile residential project near the old harbour. It was meant to be a masterpiece of modern brutalism, a tower of glass and raw concrete jutting out of the volcanic rock like a jagged tooth. I was the lead engineer on the foundation phase. The schedule was tight. The investors were breathing down my neck, demanding progress reports that looked better than the reality on the ground. We had been battling freezing rain for a week. The ground was saturated. The soil composition in that part of the city is tricky. Layers of ancient lava rock, interspersed with pockets of loose, sandy ash. It requires precision. It requires patience. That afternoon, the rain had turned into sleet. The wind was coming off the ocean in violent gusts, rattling the safety fences and stinging any exposed skin like needles. My site foreman, a young man named Jonas, came into the temporary office trailer. He looked pale. He was shaking, and it was not just from the cold. He told me that sensor 4, deep in the excavation pit, was giving erratic readings. He said the groundwater pressure was rising too fast. He suggested we halt the pour. He wanted to wait until the storm passed to reassess the stability of the north wall. I looked at him with absolute contempt. I saw a boy who was afraid of a little bad weather. I saw a delay that would cost me a bonus. I saw weakness. I pulled up the schematics on my monitor. I showed him the safety margins. I pointed to the numbers. I told him that the numbers do not lie. I told him that concrete does not care about the rain. I humiliated him. I used my experience and my reputation to crush his caution. I told him that I would go down there myself to inspect the rebar cage just to prove that he was incompetent. I put on my hard hat and my high-visibility jacket. I walked out into the storm. The cold hit me like a physical blow. The air in Reykjavik tastes different when a storm is coming off the sea. It tastes like salt and sulfur. I marched toward the excavation pit, fueled by a mixture of adrenaline and pride. I was going to prove that I was the master of this environment. I was the one who decided what was safe and what was dangerous. The pit was a gaping wound in the earth, 50 feet deep, lined with steel retaining walls. Mud slicked the temporary metal stairs leading down. The floodlights cut through the sleet, creating cones of white light in the grey misery. I could hear the ocean roaring in the distance, crashing against the harbour walls, but my focus was entirely on the job. I reached the bottom of the pit. The mud sucked at my boots. It was thick and heavy like wet cement. I walked over to the north wall, the place Jonas had been worried about. I shone my flashlight on the pressure gauges. They were high, yes, but within the theoretical limits I had calculated. I felt a surge of validation. I was right, I was always right. I turned to signal the crane operator above. I was going to wave him forward, to start the pour, to seal this foundation and my victory. Then I felt it. It was not a sound at first, it was a vibration. It came up through the soles of my boots, traveling up my shins and settling in the base of my spine. It was a low-frequency hum, the kind you feel in your chest when a large truck passes too close. But there were no trucks. I looked down at the ground. The water pooling around my feet rippled. The ripples were concentric circles, expanding rapidly. Then came the sound. It was a groan. That is the only way I can describe it. It sounded like the earth itself was in pain. It was a deep, grinding noise, rock grating against rock, steel twisting under impossible loads. It was the sound of structure failing. I looked at the retaining wall. The steel beams were bowing inward. The heavy iron bolts the size of my fist were popping out, shooting across the pit like bullets. One of them struck the mud 3 feet from me with a thud that I felt in my stomach. My mind raced. I tried to calculate the failure rate. I tried to analyze the vector of the collapse. I tried to think my way out of it. But physics was moving faster than my thoughts. The ground beneath me did not just give way. It liquefied. The soil composition changed instantly from a solid to a fluid state, a phenomenon known as liquefaction. The solid earth I was standing on became a quicksand of freezing mud and volcanic ash. I tried to run toward the stairs. I took one step and my leg sank up to the knee. I pulled, frantic, gasping for air as the cold slime filled my boot. I took another step and I sank to my waist. The noise was deafening now. The retaining wall was screaming as it tore apart. Tons of wet earth, rock and debris were pouring into the pit from above. The floodlights flickered and died, plunging the bottom of the hole into shadow. I looked up. I saw the night sky, a small square of purple-grey far above me. I saw the silhouette of the crane, and then I saw the wall of mud coming down. It was not like a wave of water. It was a landslide. It was a solid mass of earth, moving with the violence of an avalanche. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound never left my throat. The impact was immediate and total. It felt like being hit by a freight train. The air was forced out of my lungs in a single, violent burst. I was slammed backward, buried instantly. Darkness. Absolute suffocating darkness. I was conscious. That was the horror of it. I was awake. I was trapped in a vise of wet earth. The pressure was immense. It squeezed my chest, pinning my arms to my sides. I could not inhale. I tried to heave my chest to draw breath, but the earth would not yield. My mouth was full of grit. My eyes were open, staring into a blackness so complete it felt heavy on my eyeballs. Panic set in. It was a primal, animal panic. My brain, usually so disciplined and cold, shattered. I thrashed, or I tried to thrash. My muscles strained against the weight, but I could not move a millimeter. I was encased in concrete that had not yet set, but was just as heavy. My lungs burned. The need for oxygen became a sharp, stabbing agony in the center of my chest. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down the seconds of my life. I thought about my calculations. I thought about the safety margins. I thought about Jonas. I realized with a sickening clarity that I had killed myself. My pride had dug this hole, and now my pride was burying me in it. The pressure increased. It felt like my ribs were bending. The pain was excruciating. My head felt like it was going to burst. Bright spots of light danced in the darkness. The firing of dying neurons. I waited for the fade. I waited for the biological shutdown. I knew the process of asphyxiation. I knew that soon carbon dioxide narcosis would set in. I would drift away, I would sleep. And then there would be nothing, just the zero at the end of the equation. But the fade did not come. The pain did not stop. It intensified. The darkness shifted. It was no longer just the absence of light. It had a texture. It felt thick, oily, and ancient. The cold of the Icelandic mud vanished, replaced by a sensation I could not identify. It wasn't heat. It wasn't cold. It was a profound absence of life. I felt a pulling sensation. It was not gravity, it was something else. It was tugging at me, not at my body, but at something inside my body. It felt like a hook had been inserted into my solar plexus and was dragging me downward, through the mud, through the bedrock, through the crust of the earth. I was falling. I was no longer held by the earth. I was plummeting. The sensation of speed was terrifying. I was rushing downward into a void that had no bottom. The air rushed past me, but there was no wind. There was only a howling silence. I tried to scream again. I wanted to hear my own voice. I wanted to know I still existed. But no sound came out. My voice had been stripped from me. Then I stopped. I did not land. I did not hit a surface. I simply ceased falling. I opened my eyes. I was standing. I was standing on a flat, hard surface. I was breathing, but the air was stale and tasted of iron. I looked down at my hands. They were clean. The mud was gone. My high-visibility jacket was gone. I was wearing the grey suit I wore to client meetings, the expensive one, the one I wore when I wanted to intimidate people with my success. I looked up. I was in a room. But it was not a room built by human hands. It looked like a construction site, but twisted. The walls were made of a material that resembled concrete, but it pulsed. It was dark, a slate grey that seemed to absorb the dim light rather than reflect it. The geometry was wrong. As a structural engineer, I know angles. I know that a 90-degree angle creates a corner. Here the corners seemed to fold in on themselves. The perspective was distorted. If I looked at a wall, it seemed to be 5 feet away, but if I reached out, my hand passed through empty space. I was alone. The silence was the first thing that truly frightened me. In Reykjavik, even in the quietest room, there is sound. The wind outside, the hum of a refrigerator, the distant traffic. Here, the silence was aggressive. It pressed against my eardrums. It was a vacuum of sound. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself I was in the hospital. I told myself I was in a coma, dreaming. My brain was trying to make sense of the trauma. That had to be it. I was lying in a bed in the intensive care unit, and my subconscious was constructing a waiting room. "Hello?" I said. My voice did not echo. The sound left my lips and died instantly, absorbed by the grey walls. It was flat, dead, powerless. I took a step forward. My dress shoes clicked on the floor. The floor felt cold, not the cold of winter, but the cold of a dead body. It was a temperature that sapped the warmth right out of the soles of my feet. I walked toward what looked like a support column in the center of the space. I needed to touch something solid. I needed to verify the structural integrity of this hallucination. I reached out and placed my hand on the column. It was rough, like unfinished concrete, but it was vibrating. A low, constant tremor ran through it. I leaned closer. I pressed my ear against the stone. I heard something. It was faint, buried deep within the density of the pillar. It wasn't the sound of stress or load-bearing tension. It was a voice, a single, whispered voice, repeating a sequence of numbers. I pulled back, startled. I looked around the room. There was no one, just the impossible angles and the suffocating grey light that seemed to come from nowhere. I circled the pillar. The vibration grew stronger. The air in the room began to feel heavier. It wasn't atmospheric pressure, it was a spiritual weight. I felt a heaviness settle on my shoulders, like I was wearing a lead vest. I tried to calculate the load. My mind automatically went to the math. How much weight was on me? 10 kilos? 20? It grew heavier with every second. I looked at the floor. It was perfectly smooth, polished like a mirror now. I saw my reflection. But the reflection wasn't looking at me. It was looking down, its head in its hands, in a posture of utter defeat. I blinked. The reflection didn't change. I moved my hand. The reflection stayed frozen. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced my logical armor. This was not a dream. In a dream, the physics are fluid. In a dream, you can fly. Here, the physics were rigid, heavy, and cruel. The gravity was increasing. I tried to walk toward where a door should be, but my legs felt like they were moving through deep water. The air was thickening. It felt like the room was shrinking, contracting around me. I realized then that I was not in a building. I was inside a foundation, I was beneath the weight of something massive, and I was the only thing holding it up. I stared at the reflection in the polished floor. It was me, yet it was not me. The man in the floor was broken. He was hunched over, his hands covering his face, his posture one of absolute crushing despair. I, on the other hand, was standing upright. I was rigid with fear, yes, but I was standing. I moved my arm again, I waved my hand in front of my face. The reflection remained frozen. It did not mimic my movement. It simply sat there, trapped in the stone, mourning a tragedy I had not yet acknowledged. I stepped back. My breath hitched in my throat. This was scientifically impossible. A reflection is light bouncing off a surface. It is a passive optical phenomenon. It cannot have autonomy. It cannot have a mood. I squeezed my eyes shut. I told myself to focus. I am an engineer. I solve problems. I break complex disasters down into manageable variables. I needed to treat this like a structural failure. I needed to find the stress point. I needed to find the logic. I opened my eyes. I turned away from the impossible reflection and looked at the room. I needed to map my environment. If I could define the dimensions of this space, I could control my fear. I began to pace. I decided to walk the perimeter. I would count my steps. I would measure the square footage. I would find a door. There is always a door. Every structure has an ingress and an egress. It is a fundamental rule of architecture. I walked toward the nearest wall. It looked to be about 20 feet away. I took 10 steps. The wall appeared to be the same distance away. I took 10 more steps. The wall did not get closer. It was as if the space was expanding in front of me at the exact speed of my walking. I stopped. I turned around to look at the pillar I had started from. It was right behind me. I had walked 20 paces, yet I had moved nowhere. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This was not a hallucination. Hallucinations are chaotic. They are messy. This was precise. This was a violation of Euclidean geometry. The space was non-linear. The angles between the walls and the floor looked sharp, like 90-degree intersections. But when I looked closer, they seemed to twist. The lines did not meet. They curved into a darkness that my eyes could not track. I looked up. There was no ceiling. There was only a heavy grey haze that hung about 30 feet up. It looked like smoke, but it was motionless. It was a ceiling of stagnant fog. I approached the wall again, this time running. I sprinted. My dress shoes slipped on the slick floor, but I pushed forward. I needed to touch the boundary. I needed to find the limit of this cage. After what felt like 100 yards of sprinting, my hand finally struck the surface. It did not feel like concrete. It did not feel like drywall or steel. It felt like ice that had been dried of all moisture. It was impossibly smooth. There was no friction. My hand slid down it as if the wall was rejecting my touch. I leaned my forehead against it, panting. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I tried to calm my breathing. I tried to stabilize my pulse. Then I noticed the silence. I had been so focused on the visual anomalies that I had not fully processed the auditory environment. The silence here was not passive. It was not simply the absence of noise. In the physical world, silence is a vacuum waiting to be filled. Here, silence was a heavy, dense medium. It was a solid thing. It pressed against my ears. It felt like I was deep underwater, at a depth where the pressure threatens to rupture the eardrums. But there was no water. There was only the dry grey air. I tried to hum a note. I needed to break the pressure. I hummed a low C. The sound left my throat, but it did not travel. It fell from my lips like a stone and died at my feet. There was no resonance. There was no acoustic return. The air refused to carry the vibration. It was as if the atmosphere itself was designed to stifle expression. I felt a rising tide of claustrophobia. I am a man who is used to open construction sites, to the wind, to the vast Icelandic horizons. This sensation of containment was maddening. It felt like being buried alive, but without the dirt. I was buried in emptiness. I turned my back to the wall and slid down until I was sitting on the floor. I pulled my knees to my chest. I checked my pockets. I needed a tool. I needed something from the real world. My pockets were empty. My phone was gone. My wallet was gone. My laser measure was gone. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and the terrifying clarity of my own mind. I started to analyze the light. Where was it coming from? There were no fixtures, no windows, no sun. The light seemed to emanate from the grey material of the room itself. It was a flat, shadowless light. It revealed everything but illuminated nothing. It washed out the colors. My skin looked grey. The fabric of my suit looked dead and dull. I closed my eyes again and tried to recall the accident. The mud, the crushing weight, the darkness. Was I dead? I asked the question internally. I analyzed the data. I had consciousness. I had sensory input. I felt fear. Therefore I existed, but existence does not equal life. I remembered the physics of the collapse, the amount of soil that had fallen on me. The calculation was simple. Volume multiplied by density equals load. The load on my body had been in the tons. Survival was statistically impossible. The human frame cannot withstand that kind of pressure. So I was dead. The conclusion should have brought panic. Instead, it brought a cold, clinical horror. I was an atheist. I believed in the cessation of consciousness. I believed in the black screen. I had bet my entire life on the fact that there was no afterlife. I had mocked my wife when she went to church. I had laughed at her prayers. I had told her that she was talking to the ceiling. Now I was the one talking to the ceiling, and there was no one there. If I was dead and I was still conscious, then my worldview was structurally flawed. The foundation of my reality had collapsed. And if I was wrong about the end, what else was I wrong about? I stood up. I could not sit still. The anxiety was a physical thing, a parasite moving under my skin. "Is this it?" I shouted. My voice sounded pathetic. It was thin and reedy. "Is this the afterlife, a waiting room? An error in the code?" No answer. The silence pushed back harder. It began to ring in my ears, a high-pitched whine that drilled into the center of my skull. It was the sound of a nervous system redlining. I looked at the floor again. My reflection was still there, but it had moved. The figure in the floor was no longer sitting with its head in its hands. It was now looking up at me. I froze. The face in the reflection was mine, but it was twisted. The eyes were wide, rimmed with red. The mouth was open in a silent scream. It looked like a man who was being tortured. It looked like a man who was seeing something coming that I could not yet see. I stepped back, repulsed. I didn't want to look at it. It was like looking at a portrait of my own hidden terror. I walked toward the center of the room, away from the walls, away from the reflection. I needed to find a focal point. I needed a reference. I stopped at the pillar I had touched earlier. The vibration was still there. I placed my hand on it. The stone felt warmer now. Not warm like living flesh, but warm like a machine that has been running too long. It was heating up. I looked at the texture of the pillar. It wasn't concrete. I leaned in close, squinting in the flat light. The surface was etched. It was covered in microscopic lines. I traced them with my finger. They were geometric patterns, fractals, repeating loops of jagged shapes. But as I stared at them, my pattern recognition brain kicked in. They weren't random. They were architectural drawings. I recognized a truss system. I recognized a cantilever beam. I pulled back, gasping. These were my designs. I looked higher up the pillar. There, etched into the grey stone, was the schematic for the bridge I had designed in Akureyri. Below it, the layout for the shopping centre in Kopervåg. My work, my life's work. It was carved into this place. For a second, I felt a surge of pride. Even here, my genius was recorded. Even here, my legacy stood. But then I looked closer. The drawings were wrong. They were not the finished blueprints. They were the stress diagrams. They showed the failure points. They showed the cracks. Red lines, or what looked like red lines in the grey stone, traced every weakness I had ignored, every corner I had cut, every safety margin I had shaved down to save money or time. The pillar was not a monument to my success. It was a record of my negligence. I backed away from the pillar. I felt sick. My stomach churned. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, viscous. It was becoming harder to move. I realized then that the gravity was changing. When I first arrived, it felt normal. Now it felt like I was wearing a heavy backpack. My shoulders slumped. My legs felt heavy, as if the blood in my veins was turning to lead. I looked at my watch. The glass face was cracked, but the hands were moving. They were spinning, not ticking. Spinning. The second hand was a blur. The minute hand was racing around the dial. Time was broken here, or perhaps time did not exist here, and the watch was simply reacting to the absence of the dimension it was designed to measure. I tore the watch off my wrist and threw it. It didn't clatter. It hit the floor silently and slid away, disappearing into the grey haze of the distance. I was losing my anchor. I was losing my mind. I tried to use the technique I used during stressful site inspections. Assess, analyze, act, assessment. I am in a non-Euclidean space. Gravity is variable and increasing. Time is non-linear. Analysis. This is a contained environment. It is designed, it is not natural. Someone built this. Act. I need to find the architect. Who are you? I demanded, addressing the empty air. Show yourself. I want to see the plans. I want to speak to the project manager. My demand hung in the air, ridiculous and small. I was trying to assert authority in a place where I had none. I was a speck of dust, demanding an audience with the wind. The gravity increased again. It forced me to spread my feet to keep my balance. My knees trembled. It felt like the atmospheric pressure had doubled. I looked at the walls. They were moving. They were not sliding closer. They were tilting. The top of the walls was leaning inward. The room was transforming. It was becoming a funnel, a shaft. The illusion of the open floor plan dissolved. The reality asserted itself. I was not in a room. I was at the bottom of a deep, square pit. The walls shot up into the darkness for miles. I was standing on the only solid ground in an infinite vertical tunnel. And I was not alone. I felt it before I saw it. A presence. Not a ghost. Not a spirit. A mass. I looked up into the grey fog that served as a ceiling. Something was coming down. It was a slow, rhythmic descent, like a piston in a massive engine. It was the sound of something heavy displacing air. I squinted into the gloom. A shape emerged from the fog. It was a block, a massive square block of the same dark stone as the walls. It fit the shaft perfectly. There was no gap between the block and the walls. It was a plunger, and I was in the syringe. It was descending. I looked around for an exit. There was none. The walls were smooth glass-like stone. The floor was solid. I calculated the rate of descent. It was moving slowly, but it was relentless. It would reach the floor in minutes. There was no space for me. When that block hit the floor, there would be zero clearance. I was going to be crushed. The terror that washed over me was absolute. It was not just the fear of pain. It was the fear of erasure. I was going to be flattened into nothingness. I looked at the floor, desperate for a trapdoor, a crack, anything. My reflection was gone. The floor was now just a black mirror. The weight of the air pressed me down. I fell to my hands and knees. The gravity was immense now. It was pulling me flat. It wanted me prostrate. I tried to push myself up. I'm a strong man. I work with steel. I do not kneel. But the force was greater than my muscles. It was pressing on my spine, on the back of my neck. The block above me descended, blocking out the grey light. The room grew darker. The shadow of the weight fell over me. I realized then that this was not a random torture. This was a design. This was a machine built for one specific purpose: to break me. If this story is speaking to you, if something inside your heart is stirring, stay with me and take a moment to subscribe here to the channel. This is not just a video. This is an encounter with God. The geometry of the room had finalized its shift. I was no longer in a waiting area. I was at the bottom of a vertical shaft, a chimney of polished black stone that extended upward into infinity. The walls were perfectly smooth, offering no handhold, no friction, no hope of climbing. The floor was a single slab of cold iron, and above me the piston was coming down. It was a monolith of dark rock, cut to the exact dimensions of the shaft. The clearance between the falling block and the walls was less than a millimeter. I could hear the air whistling as it was forced out of the gap, pressurized by the descending mass. The sound was a high-pitched scream of escaping gas. I looked up. The bottom face of the block was flat and featureless. It was 10 feet above my head, then 8, then 6. Panic is usually chaotic, but this was a different kind of terror. This was the cold, hard realization of a structural inevitability. I ran the calculation instantly. If I stayed on the floor, I would be flattened. My biology would be smeared across the iron like paste. But if I stood, I became the support. I became the pillar. I did not want to stand. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to curl into a ball and cover my head. But the engineer in me took over. The part of my brain that understands load paths and vertical integrity forced my body to move. I scrambled to my feet. The gravity was crushing, pulling at my skin, trying to drag me back down to the iron. I fought it. I locked my knees. I planted my feet shoulder-width apart. I raised my arms, palms flat, facing the ceiling that was about to become my world. I positioned myself directly in the center of the shaft. I aligned my spine. I prepared my skeletal structure to accept the load. It was the only choice. I had to become the foundation. The block made contact. There was no sound of impact. There was only the sudden, absolute transfer of weight. It hit my hands first. The skin on my palms split instantly under the friction. The weight traveled down my wrists, shattering the small bones in my hands, compressing the radius and ulna in my forearms. I screamed, but the sound was crushed back into my throat. My elbows buckled, but I forced them to lock again. The load slammed into my shoulders. It felt like 2 steel spikes were being driven into my trapezius muscles. The pressure traveled down my spine, compressing the vertebrae, squeezing the discs until they felt like they were bursting. My knees bent. The femurs groaned. I felt the vibration of my own bones bending, approaching their yield point. I tried to push back. I summoned every ounce of strength I possessed. I am a large man. I have lifted heavy weights all my life. But this was not weight as I understood it. This was not mass times gravity. This was something else. As the block settled onto me, pinning me against the iron floor, the nature of the weight changed. It wasn't just heavy. It was personal. The pain shifted from my bones to my mind. The pressure wasn't just pushing my body down, it was pushing into my memories. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The stone block wasn't made of atoms, it was made of moments. I felt the weight of that Tuesday afternoon, the exact sensation of the freezing rain on my face, the arrogance in my chest when I looked at Jonas. I felt the weight of my sneer. I felt the density of my pride. It was heavy. It was incredibly, impossibly heavy. That single moment of arrogance weighed more than a truck, and it was sitting on my neck. Then came another layer. I felt the weight of a conversation with my wife 3 years ago. She had asked me to go to a Christmas service with her. I had laughed. I had mocked her faith with a cruel intellectual dismantling of her beliefs. I remembered the look in her eyes, the hurt I had caused, the silence that followed. That silence was now pressing down on my shoulders. It weighed tons. The block continued to descend. It did not care that I was holding it. It had an infinite downward vector. My arms were shaking violently. My triceps were tearing. I could feel the muscle fibers snapping like rubber bands. "Stop!" I gasped. "I can't hold it, it's too heavy." The architect, whoever built this place, did not answer. The only answer was more weight. Every structural flaw in my life was being converted into physical mass. Every lie I had told to a client to cover a delay was a lead brick. Every corner I had cut to save budget was a slab of granite. Every time I had looked down on someone less intelligent than me, it added another layer to the monolith crushing me. I realized with horror that I had built this block myself. I had spent 40 years quarrying these stones. I had spent a lifetime manufacturing this weight. I had thought my sins were weightless, invisible things that vanished as soon as I committed them. I thought my pride was just a state of mind. I was wrong. Pride has mass, sin has density. And now, in this place where the spiritual becomes physical, I was finally carrying what I had created. My legs began to tremble uncontrollably. The femurs were bowing. I could hear the cracking of my own skeleton. It sounded like dry wood stepping on a fire. I tried to shift the load. I tried to move my feet to get better leverage, but my feet were fused to the floor. The iron floor had become sticky, bonding with the soles of my shoes. I was part of the structure now. I was a fixed column. The pain was beyond the capacity of nerves to transmit. It became a white noise in my brain. I was being ground down. It felt like I was being put through a rock crusher, but I wasn't breaking apart. That was the cruelty of it. In the physical world, when the load exceeds the structural capacity, the column fails. It buckles. It collapses. The pain ends because the structure is destroyed. Here the laws of physics were rewritten. I was experiencing total structural failure, yet I remained intact. I was breaking, but I was not allowed to break. I was being pulverized, yet I held my shape. The sweat pouring off my face was not water. It was blood. The capillaries in my forehead had burst under the internal pressure. My eyes felt like they were being pushed out of their sockets. I looked down at the floor, my chin pressed against my chest by the weight. The floor was no longer black, it was translucent. Beneath my feet, deep under the glass-like surface, I saw them. I saw thousands of others. They were like me, each one alone in their own shaft. Each one standing or kneeling, arms raised, holding up their own blocks of darkness. They were a forest of living columns, a basement of suffering souls holding up the foundation of this terrible place. Some were weeping, some were screaming silently, some were just staring blankly, their spirits long since eroded by the pressure. I saw a man in a business suit. I saw a woman in hospital scrubs. I saw a young man in a t-shirt. They were all engineers of their own destruction, bearing the loads they had calculated were safe to carry. I understood then the architecture of hell. It is not a chaotic pit of fire. It is a structure. It is a vast, meticulously designed edifice built from the pride of men. We are the bricks. We are the mortar. We are the pillars, holding up the weight of our own rejection of God. The block slipped. My left arm gave way. There was a sickening snap. My elbow hyperextended, bending backward. The weight slammed down onto my left shoulder, driving me to one knee. The impact shattered my kneecap. I gasped, sucking in the stale, dead air. I was now kneeling, holding up the weight of the world with one trembling arm and a broken shoulder. The block did not stop. It kept pushing. It wanted me flat. It wanted me to become the floor. "Please," I whispered. It was the first time in my life I had pleaded for anything. "I can't." The silence pressed in. The pressure increased. And then I saw the writing on the floor again. My face was inches from the iron now. The blueprints I had seen earlier on the pillar were here too, etched directly into the ground where my tears and blood were falling. But they weren't just drawings anymore. They were moving. The lines of the blueprint were shifting, reconfiguring. They were drawing a new diagram. I focused my blurring eyes. I tried to make sense of the schematic. It was a diagram of a human heart. But it was drawn like a building. It had chambers labeled Vault of Pride, one chamber of greed and foundation of self, and right through the center of the drawing, a thick red line was drawn. It was the symbol for demolition. I was not here to be punished. I was here to be demolished. The architect had inspected the building of my life, found it structurally unsound, and ordered it to be condemned. The weight pressed harder. My remaining arm began to bend. I was going down. My right arm was trembling so violently that the vibrations traveled down my spine, rattling my teeth. I was kneeling on one knee, the shattered cap of the other grinding into the iron floor with every micro-movement. The massive block of dark stone hovered inches above my head, held up only by the structural integrity of my remaining strength. I was a tripod of bone and muscle, one arm, two legs, fighting against a load that was designed to flatten me. I stared at the floor. My sweat pooled there, mixing with the blood dripping from my nose. In the reflection of that dark fluid, I saw movement. I was not alone in the shaft. I heard the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. It was the sound of expensive leather soles striking a polished surface. Click, click, click. The sound was crisp, echoing in the narrow space despite the suffocating acoustics I had experienced earlier. A pair of shoes walked into my field of vision. They were black Oxfords, Italian leather, impeccably shined. I knew them. I owned a pair exactly like them. I wore them to board meetings. I wore them when I wanted to signal status. My eyes traveled up the pant legs. charcoal grey wool, perfectly tailored, with a sharp crease down the center. I recognized the fabric. It was my suit, the one I had bought in London after landing the harbour contract. I craned my neck, fighting the immense pressure that tried to force my chin to my chest. I had to see. Standing over me was a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and projected an air of absolute command. He held a clipboard in his left hand and a silver pen in his right. He was looking down at me with an expression of mild, professional disappointment. It was me. It was Einar. But it was not the broken, muddy, bleeding Einar kneeling on the floor. It was the Einar I presented to the world. It was the Einar of the ribbon-cutting ceremonies. His hair was perfectly styled. His tie was knotted in a precise Windsor. His face was clean, shaven and composed. He did not look like a demon. He did not have horns or red eyes. He looked like a senior partner at an engineering firm conducting a site inspection of a failed project. The horror of seeing him, of seeing myself, was worse than any monster I could have imagined. If a demon had walked in, I could have externalized the evil. I could have said, "This is an enemy." But this man was me. He was the personification of my intellect, my pride and my ego. He was the architect. He clicked his pen. The sound was sharp, like a bone snapping. "Structural failure imminent," he said. His voice was my voice. But it was stripped of all warmth. It was the voice I used when I fired people. It was the voice I used when I told clients that their budget was insufficient. It was cold, logical, and terrifyingly calm. "Who are you?" I gasped. My voice was a wet, ragged wheeze. He ignored the question. He stepped closer, circling me slowly. He was inspecting me. He looked at my trembling arm. He looked at the angle of my spine. He made a note on his clipboard. "Lateral bracing is compromised," he muttered to himself, as if I were a steel beam that had rusted. "Load-bearing capacity is reduced by 80%. Material fatigue is evident in the core." He stopped in front of me and crouched down, balancing effortlessly on the balls of his feet. He looked directly into my eyes. There was no pity in his gaze, there was only analysis. "You are wondering about the weight," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "You are calculating the mass. You are trying to figure out why the numbers don't add up." He tapped the clipboard with his pen. "The calculation is correct, Einar. The load is perfectly balanced against the strength of the material. The problem is not the weight. The problem is the quality of the pillar." He stood up and walked around to my side, looking at my broken shoulder. He reached out and touched it with the tip of his pen. A bolt of white-hot agony shot through my body. I screamed, but the weight pressed the air out of my lungs, turning the scream into a gurgle. "Substandard materials," he said, shaking his head. "We warned you about the foundation. You cannot build a skyscraper on ash." "I am not a building," I shouted inside my mind, forcing the words out through grit teeth. "I am a man." "Are you?" the architect asked. He flipped a page on his clipboard. "Let's review the specifications." He began to read. He wasn't reading engineering specs. He was reading my life. But he was translating my actions into the language of structural failure. "Item 1, he announced. "The Jonas incident, Tuesday, 2:15 p.m. He looked at me over the top of the clipboard. "Analysis. You observed a critical safety warning from a subordinate. Instead of reinforcing the structure, you applied excessive shear force to the human element. You humiliated the support staff. You ignored the data to preserve the timeline." He made a check mark on the paper. "Result: catastrophic loss of integrity. You prioritized the facade over the foundation. That is a violation of the building code, Einar. That is negligence." I felt the weight of the stone block increase. It wasn't my imagination. As he spoke the words, the physical mass of the stone grew heavier. The guilt of that moment, the memory of Jonas's face as I belittled him, was transmuting into gravity. My arm buckled another inch. My nose was now touching the iron floor. "Item 2, the architect continued, his voice droning on with sickening neutrality. "The marriage contract. Year 7. Anniversary dinner." I squeezed my eyes shut. I didn't want to hear this. I knew exactly what moment he was talking about. Subject displayed a complete lack of thermal insulation, the architect read. When the wife expressed fear regarding her medical diagnosis, the subject responded with statistical probabilities of survival rather than empathy. Subject mocked the concept of prayer as inefficient resource allocation. Subject created a cold bridge in the domestic structure, allowing frost to penetrate the core of the relationship. He paused and looked down at me. You froze her out, Einar. You treated her fear like a math problem. You solved the equation, but you destroyed the home. Structural damage. Irreparable. The block pressed down harder. My radius bone was bowing. I could feel the stress fractures opening up inside my forearm. The pain was absolute. It was a symphony of nerve signals screaming for release. Stop it, I whispered. Please. We do not stop inspections halfway, the architect said. We must determine if the structure can be salvaged or if it must be condemned. He flipped another page. The sound of the paper turning was loud, crisp, final. Item 3. The rejection of the cornerstone. He stopped walking. He stood directly in front of my face. I could see the polished shine of his shoes. I could see the sharp cuff of his trousers. Throughout the operational lifespan, the subject was presented with multiple opportunities to integrate the primary load-bearing element, the concept of God. Subject consistently rejected this element as superfluous and illogical. Subject relied entirely on internal tensile strength, pride, intellect, ego. He leaned down again. His face was inches from mine. He smelled like expensive cologne and ozone. And now we test that strength, don't we? We are testing the hypothesis of the self-made man. You built this life, Einar. You designed it. You said you didn't need a crutch. You said you didn't need a savior. You said your logic was strong enough to hold up the sky. He gestured upward at the massive, crushing stone block. So hold it. The cruelty of it was precise. He wasn't mocking me with laughter. He was mocking me with my own philosophy. He was using my own worldview to dismantle me. I had lived by the belief that a man stands on his own 2 feet, that he carries his own weight. Now hell was giving me exactly what I wanted. It was letting me carry my own weight, and it was crushing me. I can't, I choked out. It's too heavy. The architect stood up and sighed. He tapped the pen against his teeth, a habit I had when I was thinking. That is an admission of structural failure, he said. If the column cannot support the load, the column is defective. In the real world, what do we do with defective materials, Einar? Do we leave them in place? Do we hope they get better? I knew the answer. I had given the order 1,000 times. No, I whispered. Speak up, he commanded. No, I said louder, my voice breaking. We remove them. Correct. We demolition them. We pulverize them. We clear the site. He made a large, sweeping X on the clipboard. Recommendation: total demolition. The subject is unfit for purpose. The soul has no rebar. There is no steel in you, Einar, only pride. And pride is brittle. It doesn't bend, it shatters. He turned and began to walk away. He was leaving me. He was leaving me to the weight. Wait, I screamed. Help me. You're me. You have to help me. He stopped and looked back over his shoulder. The look on his face was one of genuine confusion. Help you? I am the one who put you here. I am the culmination of your choices. I am the monument you built. You cannot ask the statue to save the sculptor. He turned back to the darkness. Enjoy the collapse, Einar. You designed it. He walked into the shadows and vanished. As soon as he was gone, the room changed. The clinical atmosphere evaporated. The emotional protection of the inspection was gone. Now there was only the raw, brutal physics of the situation. The weight doubled. My right arm, the only thing keeping my head from being crushed into the iron, gave out. It didn't break. The muscle simply died. It ceased to function. I collapsed. My face hit the floor. The stone block came down on my back. It did not kill me. That would have been mercy. Instead, it pinned me flat. I was pressed so tightly against the floor that I couldn't expand my chest to breathe. I was taking shallow, panic-stricken sips of air. The pressure was exerted on every square inch of my body. It felt like I was being passed through a rolling mill. My eyes were pressed shut. My mouth was mashed against the cold iron. I was no longer a man. I was a layer of biological matter trapped between two immovable forces. And in that darkness, with the weight of my sins literally pressing the life out of me, I began to hear the sounds of the others again. When I was standing, I couldn't hear them. My own struggle was too loud, but now that I was flattened, now that I was at the bottom, the acoustics shifted. The floor was vibrating with sound. It was a chorus of groans, a low, continuous frequency of suffering. It came from below me, it came from the sides. I realized the floor wasn't solid. It was a grid, a mesh. I forced one eye open. I was pressed against the surface so hard that my vision was blurred, but I could see through the translucent material of the floor. There was another shaft below me, and another man. He was standing, holding up the ceiling of his cell, which was the floor of mine. He was holding me up, and below him another, and another. It was a column of human souls, extending down into the abyss, each one crushed by the weight of the one above, each one adding to the misery of the one below. We were the structure of hell. We were the bricks in the wall of separation from God. I looked down at the man beneath me. He was screaming, but no sound came out. He was buckling under my weight. I was the burden. I was the stone block for him. The horror of it clawed at my mind. I wasn't just a victim. I was an instrument of torture. My sin wasn't just crushing me, it was crushing someone else. The architect was right. I was a defect. I was a flaw. I was something that needed to be removed. I tried to close my eyes, but the pressure kept the lids peeled back. I was forced to watch. I was forced to see the chain of pain I was part of. Then the logic centers of my brain, the parts the architect had mocked, began to misfire. I started to hallucinate geometry. I saw equations floating in the darkness, but they weren't balancing. The numbers swirled around me, mocking me. I had worshipped math. Now math was showing me the impossibility of my survival. I felt a crack in my chest. Not a bone, something deeper. The center of my being was fracturing. The integrity of myself was failing. I was about to cease to be Einar. I was about to become just another layer of sediment in the geology of the damned. And for the first time in 40 years, the structural engineer realized that he could not fix this. I didn't have the materials. I didn't have the tools. I didn't have the strength. I needed a different architect. I was becoming the pavement. That is the only way to describe the physical reality of what was happening to me. The distinction between my body and the environment was dissolving. The immense pressure of the stone block was not just crushing my bones. It was forcing the very atoms of my being to fuse with the floor. I could feel the cold iron of the shaft pressing into my chest, but it wasn't stopping at the skin. It was merging. The molecular boundary between Einar and hell was breaking down. I felt my ribcage flattening, spreading out like batter on a griddle. My fingers, splayed out above my head in a desperate attempt to push back, were sinking into the floor, becoming indistinguishable from the dark, translucent material that separated me from the screamer below. I was losing my form. I was losing the container of my soul. In structural engineering, we talk about plastic deformation. It is the point where a material is stressed beyond its elastic limit. It stretches, it changes shape, and it never returns to its original form. I was experiencing plastic deformation of the spirit. I was being rolled out, thinned, stretched into a two-dimensional layer of suffering. And yet, my mind was still racing. That was the torture. My body was a ruin, a smear of biological matter under a falling mountain, but my intellect, my God, my idol, was firing on all cylinders. I tried to argue. I could not move my jaw. My face was mashed into the iron, but I could speak in my mind. I could project my thoughts. And in this place, thoughts had substance. "This is inefficient," I screamed internally. "This is a waste of energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred. What is the purpose of this transfer? What is the utility?" I was trying to use the laws of thermodynamics to negotiate with damnation. I was trying to audit the physics of hell. I felt a bubbling sensation in my throat. I forced my mouth open against the pressure of the floor. I wanted to scream my logic into the darkness. I wanted to prove that this punishment was a calculation error. I am a man of reason, I tried to shout, but words did not come out. Instead, a thick black sludge poured from my lips. It was viscous, like crude oil mixed with ash. It oozed out of my mouth, hot and choking, pooling around my face. I gagged. I tried to spit it out, but it kept coming. It was vomit, but it wasn't biological. It was verbal. It was the physical manifestation of my arguments. Every logical point I tried to make turned into this black bile. I was a good citizen. More sludge filling my nose. I paid my taxes. The sludge burned my eyes. I never killed anyone. The sludge coated my throat, suffocating me. I realized with a jolt of horror that my reasoning was toxic here. On Earth, my logic had been my shield. It was clean, sharp, and sterile. Here, in the presence of absolute truth, my human logic was revealed for what it truly was. Pollution. It was waste. The architect had been right. My intellect was not a diamond, it was a tumor. My rationalizations for ignoring God, my clever debates, my scientific skepticism, my arrogant dismissals of faith, they were just sewage. And now I was drowning in them. The sludge pooled around my head, sticky and foul. It smelled of sulfur and old ink. It was the ink of every blueprint I had drawn to glorify myself. It was the ink of every contract I had signed to secure my own comfort. I stopped trying to speak. I stopped trying to argue. The logic was killing me faster than the weight. I lay there, flattened, silent, bubbling in my own filth. The stone block above me settled lower. It was now compressing my skull. I felt the sutures of my cranium groaning. My brain felt like it was being squeezed in a hydraulic press. And in that moment of total physical and intellectual defeat, a new understanding broke through. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a deduction. It was a revelation. The weight wasn't coming from above. I had spent the last however long I had been there, believing that the stone block was an external punishment. I thought it was a torture device sent by God or the devil to crush me. But as my mind fractured, the illusion of the shaft faded for a second. I saw the truth. There was no stone block. There was no shaft. There was no architect in a suit. There was only me. The weight was me. I was carrying myself. The crushing burden was the density of my own ego. For 50 years, I had built a life where I was the center. I was the authority. I was the judge. I was the source of truth. Do you know how heavy a human soul is when it tries to be God? It is infinite. Only God can hold the weight of being the center. He is the unmoved mover. He is the foundation. But when a human being tries to displace God, when a finite creature tries to occupy the infinite throne of I Am, the gravity of that arrogance is enough to collapse a star. I wasn't being punished for my sins like a child being spanked. I was finally feeling the actual weight of the sins themselves. My pride wasn't a list of bad deeds. It was a gravitational field. I remembered the times I had looked at the stars and felt nothing but cold appreciation for the physics of nuclear fusion. I had refused to see the hand behind them. That refusal was a weight. I remembered the times I had looked at my wife's tears and felt superior to her emotions. That superiority was a weight. I remembered standing on the edge of the excavation pit, ignoring the warning, thinking I knew better than the earth itself. That hubris was the heaviest thing of all. I was my own executioner. The architect I had seen was just a mirror. He wasn't a separate entity. He was the part of me that had judged the world, and now, by the perfect law of justice, I was being judged by the same standard. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you. I had heard that verse once. I had laughed at it. I thought it was poetic nonsense. Now it was the only physics that mattered. I had measured the world with cold, hard, unforgiving logic, and now cold, hard, unforgiving logic was measuring me. It was finding me wanting. It was crushing me into dust. The pain reached a crescendo. My vision went white. The black sludge, the grey walls, the iron floor, it all dissolved into a blinding field of agony. I felt my soul tearing. It wasn't a physical tear. It was an ontological tear. The I that was Einar was being ripped apart. The engineer, the husband, the skeptic, the man, these layers were being peeled off like skin. I was being unmade. In the construction world, when a building is condemned, we don't just knock it down. We strip it. We remove the copper, the steel, the glass. We gut it until only the skeleton remains. And then we bring the skeleton down. I was being gutted. "I am Einar!" I screamed in my mind, a last desperate attempt to hold on to my identity. "No," the silence answered. "You are nothing." "I am a structural engineer." "No," the weight pressed. "You are a collapse." "I exist only because he allows it." That thought shattered me. The realization that my very existence, even in this hell, was sustained by the God I hated. I wasn't holding myself up. I never had. I thought I was the pillar. I thought I was the foundation. But I was just a crack in the wall. If God withdrew his hand, I wouldn't just die. I would vanish. I would be deleted. The terror of non-existence is worse than pain. The fear of simply blinking out, of being erased from the ledger of reality, seized me. I didn't want to be unmade. Even this pain, even this crushing weight was better than the zero. I looked down into the floor again. The man beneath me, the one I was crushing, was gone. The floor was clearing. I was sinking lower. I was passing through the floor. The iron was becoming liquid again, like the mud in the pit in Reykjavik. I was sinking into the geology of hell. I was descending toward the core, and I knew what was at the core. It wasn't fire. It wasn't a monster. It was the absolute, total absence of God. The shaft above me was bad. The weight was bad. But there was still structure, there was still a floor, there was still a up and a down. Where I was going, there was no structure, there was no geometry, there was only chaos. I was sliding into the outer darkness, the place where the laws of physics are not just broken, but forgotten. My hands clawed at the iron floor, trying to find a grip, trying to stop the descent. But my fingers were slick with the black sludge of my own logic. I couldn't hold on. "Help!" The word ripped out of me. It wasn't a demand this time, it wasn't an argument. It was a raw, primal noise. I was sliding, my chest was passing through the floor, my face was sinking into the cold, dark medium. I was drowning in the stone. I thought of my blueprints, I thought of my towers, I thought of the steel and the glass and the concrete. All of it was dust, all of it was straw. None of it could stop this fall. I needed a foundation that I hadn't built. I needed a rock that wasn't made of my own pride. The sludge filled my mouth completely. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't see. I could only feel the crushing weight and the sickening sensation of falling through the floor of the universe. I was a falling stone, dropping into a bottomless well. And for the first time, I stopped trying to be the engineer. I stopped trying to calculate the fall. I stopped trying to fix it. I gave up. Total, absolute surrender. I let go of the idea that I could save myself. I let go of the idea that I was worth saving. I let go of Einar. And in that moment of total emptiness, in that nanosecond where my pride finally reached zero, something happened. I hit the bottom. I hit the bottom. It was not a physical impact in the way a body hits the ground after a fall. It was a spiritual collision. It was the moment where the falling sensation ceased, because there was simply nowhere lower to go. I had reached the absolute nadir of existence. I was lying flat, face down, pressed against a surface that felt harder than diamond, colder than absolute zero, and more real than anything I had ever touched in the world above. The black sludge of my logic had stopped flowing. My arguments were gone, my pride was gone, the architect was gone. There was only the crushing weight of the darkness above me, and this immovable, unforgiving surface beneath me. I lay there in the silence. It was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the aggressive, ringing silence of the shaft. It was the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a project that has been abandoned. I was a ruin. I was a pile of rubble that used to be a man. I tried to move my fingers. I couldn't. I tried to expand my lungs. I couldn't. I was existing in a state of suspended suffocation, where the need for air was a constant burning agony, yet death refused to come and release me. I stared into the blackness. My eyes were pressed against the floor, but I could feel the texture of it against my cheek. It wasn't the smooth, polished iron of the shaft anymore. It was rough. It was hewn stone. It felt ancient. It felt like rock that had been there before the universe was born. As I lay there, crushed and helpless, A strange clarity began to rise from that stone. It wasn't an intellectual clarity, it was a memory. I remembered a job site in Keflavik years ago. We were retrofitting an old church that had been damaged by tremors. I was there to inspect the foundation. I remembered walking around the perimeter with the pastor, an old man with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to look right through my cynicism. I had pointed out a large, irregular stone at the corner of the basement wall. I told him it was inefficient. I told him it didn't fit the modern grid. I told him we should drill it out and replace it with reinforced concrete. The old man had smiled and shook his head. He touched the stone and said, "You cannot remove this, Einar. This is the cornerstone. If you move this, the whole building falls. It doesn't look like much to you, but it bears the weight of 2 walls. It connects the structure. It is the only thing holding this house together." I had laughed at him. I had called him sentimental. I drilled around it, ignored it, and poured my concrete over it. I buried it because it didn't fit my design. Now, lying in the dark, pressed against this ancient rough surface, the verse the old man had quoted to me came back. It didn't come back as scripture. It came back as an engineering principle. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. I was the builder. I had spent my entire life rejecting the stone. I had inspected the gospel and marked it as unfit for use. I had looked at the cross and seen a structural weakness, a foolishness, a myth for weak people who couldn't stand on their own. I had built my life, my career, my marriage, and my identity on the premise that I didn't need that stone. I used concrete, I used logic, I used money, I used reputation. And now all of my materials had failed. The concrete had liquefied. The logic had turned to sludge. The money was dust. The reputation was a joke. The only thing left, the only thing solid enough to exist at the bottom of this pit, was the stone I had rejected. I realized with a jolt of terror that I wasn't just lying on a random rock. I was lying on him. I was lying on the foundation of the universe. He was here, he was at the bottom, he was in the lowest place. I had thought God was high above, looking down with judgment. But the foundation is always at the bottom. The foundation bears the weight of the entire structure. I felt a tremble go through my spirit. It wasn't fear of punishment anymore. It was the terror of recognition. I had built my house on sand, and the rain came, and the floods came, and it fell. And great was the fall of it. I was the wreckage, and I had landed on the rock. The weight of the stone block above me, the weight of my sin, my pride, my ego, was still crushing me. It felt like it was going to grind me into powder. I knew with the certainty of a mathematician that I could not lift it. I could not move it 1 millimeter. I was structurally compromised. I was finished. But if I couldn't carry it, maybe the foundation could. That was the thought. It was the first humble thought I had ever had. I stopped trying to be strong. I stopped trying to be the hero of my own story. I stopped trying to calculate a solution. I opened my mouth, pressing my lips against the rough stone floor. "I can't do it," I whispered. The confession tasted like blood. "I can't hold it up. I'm broken. The load is too heavy." I waited. The darkness did not lift. The pain did not stop. "I am a failure," I said. "I am a structural failure. I am the builder who was wrong." Tears began to leak from my eyes, hot and stinging. They ran down my face and soaked into the stone. "You are the cornerstone," I choked out. "I rejected you. I mocked you. But you are the only thing that's solid." I summoned every last ounce of will I had left. I focused all my remaining consciousness into a single plea. It wasn't a religious recitation. It was a transfer of load. It was an engineer signing over responsibility for a collapsing building. "Jesus!" I screamed the name. I didn't scream it as a curse. I screamed it as a designation. I screamed it as the name of the architect who could fix what I had destroyed. "Jesus, take the weight. It's crushing me. I can't carry it anymore. You carry it. You take it." I screamed until my throat tore. "I surrender. I surrender the building. I surrender the blueprints. I surrender the pride. Take it all. It's yours. I am nothing. You are everything." For a second, there was absolute silence. The kind of silence that happens after a demolition charge is detonated, before the building starts to fall. Then the floor cracked. It didn't crack like ice. It didn't crack like rock. It cracked like a seal being broken. A fissure opened up beneath my face, but darkness didn't come out of it. Light came out. It was blinding. It was brighter than the arc of a welding torch. It was a white-hot brilliance that seared through my closed eyelids. But it didn't burn. It didn't hurt. It pushed. The light wasn't just illumination. It was a force. It was a physical substance. It shot up from the crack in the stone, pushing against my chest, pushing against the weight that was crushing me. I felt the pressure lift. It was impossible. The weight of my sin was infinite. Nothing could move it. But this light was stronger than the gravity of hell. The stone block above me, the monolith of my pride, groaned. I heard the sound of rock grinding against rock. The light was lifting it off me. I gasped, sucking in air that didn't taste like iron and death. It tasted like ozone. It tasted like a storm. It tasted like life. "Get up," a voice said. It wasn't a whisper this time. It wasn't the cold, dead voice of the architect. It was a voice like the sound of many waters. It was deep, resonant, and shaking with power. It was a voice that commanded atoms to bond and stars to burn. "Get up, Einar." I pushed against the floor. My arms, which had been dead and broken moments ago, surged with strength. The bones knitted together. The muscles reattached. The pain vanished, replaced by a heat that flowed through my veins like molten gold. I scrambled to my knees. The crack in the floor widened. The light exploded outward, filling the shaft, dissolving the grey walls, vaporizing the black sludge. I looked up. The massive stone block, the weight of my sin, was floating. It was being held up by a single beam of that brilliant light. And then, before my eyes, the block began to crumble. It turned to dust. The light didn't just lift it. It annihilated it. The record of my wrongs, the heavy burden of my guilt, simply ceased to exist in the presence of that glory. I stood up. I was trembling not from weakness, but from awe. I looked down at the floor. The crack had become a doorway. The light wrapped around me. It felt solid. It felt like I was being encased in a new kind of armor. I realized then that I wasn't just being rescued. I was being rebuilt. The old Einar, the one made of pride and logic, had been crushed. This new man was being poured into a new mold. I felt a hand grab my wrist. It was a strong, calloused hand, a builder's hand. It pulled. The sensation of ascent was violent. I was yanked upward faster than the speed of falling. I shot up through the shaft, through the layers of the earth, through the darkness. The walls of hell blurred into streaks of grey. The screams of the others faded away. I was rising. I was going home. I closed my eyes and let the light consume me. I let go of everything. I was no longer the engineer. I was the construction site, and the master builder had finally taken over the project. If you are watching this, and you feel that pressure in your chest, that weight you can't explain, don't wait until the floor gives way. Don't wait until you are crushed. The foundation is right there. If you want to see how this story ends, and how I came back from the dead to walk among the living again, make sure you are subscribed. You need to hear the rest of this. The light became brighter, turning from white to gold to a blue so deep it looked like the sky before dawn. I heard a sound. It was the beeping of a machine. The first thing I felt was not pain, but weightlessness. After the infinite crushing pressure of the shaft, the sensation of simply lying on a mattress felt like floating on a cloud. I opened my eyes. The light was harsh, fluorescent, and stinging, but it was the light of the living. It was the sterile white of a hospital ceiling, not the dead grey of the pit. A face hovered over me. It was blurred at first, a kaleidoscope of worry and exhaustion. Then it resolved. It was my wife. Her eyes were red, swollen from crying, but when she saw my eyelids flutter, a gasp escaped her throat. She didn't say a word. She just collapsed onto my chest, weeping. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw. I tried to move my hand to touch her hair, but my arm was encased in a heavy cast. I looked down at my body. I was a landscape of plaster and wires. My legs were suspended in traction. Tubes ran in and out of my chest. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor was the only music in the room. It had been 3 weeks. The doctors told me later what had happened. They said it was a statistical anomaly. When the retaining wall failed and the landslide buried the pit, a massive steel I-beam had twisted as it fell. It had landed directly over me, creating a triangular void, a small pressurized pocket of air amidst tons of wet earth and rock. They had spent 2 days digging. They expected to find a corpse. Instead, they found a broken man, unconscious, hypothermic, but with a pulse that refused to stop. They called it a miracle of physics. They talked about the tensile strength of the steel and the angle of the collapse. They showed me the diagrams of the accident site, marveling at the probability. I looked at their drawings and I didn't see luck. I saw the architect. I saw the hand that I had rejected reaching down into the mud to create a space for me to breathe, even while my soul was being taken to the woodshed of eternity. The recovery was brutal. My body was shattered. Both legs were broken. My pelvis was fractured. My left arm was crushed and I had severe internal bleeding. I spent months in that hospital bed in Reykjavik. The winter turned to spring, and I watched the light change outside the window, from the bruised purple of December to the pale gold of April. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the reconstruction of my mind. In the quiet of the night, when the nurses were at the station and the ward was silent, I would close my eyes and I would be back there. I would feel the weight of the stone block. I would hear the click of the architect's shoes. I would feel the black sludge of my own logic choking me. For the first time in my life, I didn't push those thoughts away. I didn't try to analyze them or rationalize them as trauma-induced hallucinations. I let them sit there. I examined them. I realized that the man who fell into that pit died there. The arrogant engineer, the man who thought he could measure the universe with a ruler, the man who mocked his wife's prayers. He was dead. He had been demolished. The man lying in the hospital bed was a new project. I was a renovation. My wife sat by my bed every day. At first, I was afraid to look at her. I remembered the inspection in the shaft. I remembered how the architect had listed my coldness toward her as a structural flaw. I felt a shame so deep it burned. One afternoon, while she was reading a book, I reached out with my good hand and touched hers. She looked up, surprised. "I saw it," I whispered. My voice was still a rasp. "I saw the blueprints." She frowned, confused. "What blueprints, Einar? The accident report?" "No," I said. "The blueprints of us. The blueprints of my heart. I failed the inspection, Clara. I failed everything." I told her. I told her everything. I told her about the shaft, the weight, the sludge, and the stone at the bottom. I told her that I had been wrong about the math. I told her that 0 doesn't equal 0. 0 equals the need for God. She didn't laugh. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't bring up the years of my mockery. She just held my hand and wept. And for the first time in our marriage, the wall between us, the wall I had built with my intellect, crumbled. It took me a year to walk again. I walk with a cane now. The doctors say I will always have a limp. The cartilage in my left knee is gone and the bones didn't set perfectly. I don't mind the limp. In fact, I cherish it. It is my reminder. Every step I take requires a conscious shift of weight. Every step is a lesson in balance. Every time I lean on that cane, I am reminded that I cannot stand on my own. I went back to the site once, after the project was finished. Another firm had taken over the foundation work. The tower now stands tall against the Reykjavik skyline, a monument to glass and steel. I stood on the pavement looking up at it. A younger engineer came up to me. He recognized me. He looked at my cane and my scarred face with a mixture of pity and respect. "It's a beautiful structure, isn't it?" he asked, gesturing to the tower. "The load distribution is perfect." I looked at the building, and then I looked down at the ground. I thought about what lay beneath the concrete. I thought about the deep, dark earth where I had learned the truth. "The structure is only as good as the cornerstone," I said quietly. He nodded, thinking I was talking about masonry. "Of course. That's Engineering 101. "No," I said, looking him in the eye. "It's not engineering, it's theology. I don't build high-rises anymore. I don't chase the big contracts or the awards. I closed my firm. I work as a consultant now, mostly for small residential projects and, strangely enough, for churches. I help them fix their foundations. I crawl into the dark, damp basements of old buildings, and I look for the cracks. I look for the settling. But my real work happens when I put down the flashlight. I talk to the men on the sites. I talk to the young engineers who are so full of pride and certainty. I see the same look in their eyes that I used to see in the mirror, the belief that they are the masters of their reality. I tell them my story. I don't preach. I don't use fancy religious words. I use the language of our trade. I talk about load limits. I talk about material fatigue. I talk about the inevitable collapse of any structure that tries to defy the laws of the architect. Some of them laugh. Some of them walk away. But some of them listen. Some of them look at their own lives, at the weight they are carrying, and they recognize the stress fractures. I am telling you this now because you are building something. You are building a life. You are stacking days on top of weeks and years on top of decades. You are using materials like career, money, relationships, and perhaps, like me, your own intelligence. And you think it's stable. You think it will hold. I am here to give you the inspection report. If your foundation is yourself, it will fail. It is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. The storm will come. The ground will shake. The weight will become too much. You cannot carry your own sins. You were not designed for that load. The human soul has a maximum capacity, and the weight of a life lived without God exceeds it by an infinite margin. Do not wait until the walls come down. Do not wait until you are buried under the rubble of your own choices. There is a cornerstone. He is already there at the bottom of the pit, waiting to take the weight. He has already calculated the load, and he has already paid the price of the demolition. All you have to do is stop trying to be the pillar. All you have to do is fall on him.